The letter came with the second post, wedged between a seed catalogue addressed to the previous tenant and something official-looking from the Inland Revenue that Albert Campion had no intention of opening until at least Thursday. He had been standing in his Piccadilly flat in a dressing gown of indeterminate vintage, consulting a cold cup of tea about the general unworthiness of mornings, when Magersfontein Lugg appeared in the doorway, holding the post as though it had personally offended him. "One for you," said Lugg. "Rest is rubbish." This was, Campion reflected, a fairly accurate summary of most correspondence. He took the offered envelope with the mild curiosity of a man who has learned not to expect too much from sealed paper and examined it briefly before opening it. The handwriting on the front was careful, the kind that becomes careful because the writer has trained herself out of some earlier, more expressive hand. The postmark read Morcott Pellow, Suffolk, which told him nothing except that Suffolk still existed, which was reassuring if not immediately useful. He unfolded the letter and read it at the window, where the pale October light gave the page a quality of uncertain honesty. "Dear Mr. Campion, you will not know me. My name is Dorothea Thurston. I was given your name by my cousin, Mrs. Helena Fotherby, who tells me you are a man of discretion and uncommon perceptiveness, and that you have in the past assisted in matters that could not comfortably be brought to the official attention of the police. My husband, Reginald Thurston, died 12 days ago in the drawing-room of our home, Fenwick Hall, at approximately 9:30 in the evening. Dr. Prentice attended and attributed the death to cardiac failure, which is entirely consistent with my husband's medical history. Reginald had a weak heart. Everyone knew it. Dr. Prentice has known it for 4 years. I do not doubt Dr. Prentice's medical competence. What I cannot account for is a feeling I am aware of, how inadequate that word is, that something in the room was wrong that evening. I cannot name it precisely. I have attempted to, many times, in the fortnight since. There was something about the arrangement of the room, or perhaps it was the behavior of one of our guests, or perhaps it was simply that my husband, a man of settled habits and particular temperament, had seemed unusual in some small but distinct way during the final hour of his life. I have been told this is grief speaking. Perhaps it is, but I find I cannot dismiss it, and I find equally that I cannot raise it in this village without consequences I am not yet prepared to manage. I would be most grateful if you could come. Yours sincerely, Dorothea Thurston. P.S. There were 5 people in the house that evening besides Reginald and myself. I have said nothing to any of them about writing to you. Campion read the postscript twice. He folded the letter along its original creases and stood for a moment looking at the pigeons on the opposite rooftop, who were conducting a dispute of their own with rather less restraint than Mrs. Thurston. There was much to recommend the letter. It was not hysterical. It did not accuse anyone. It asked for help in the manner of someone who had thought very carefully about whether to ask at all and had decided to ask anyway, which in Campion's experience represented a more reliable instinct than certainty. Certainty, he had found, usually meant that someone had already decided what they wanted confirmed. Mrs. Thurston's letter asked a more difficult thing. She wanted to know whether she was right to be uneasy. That was not the same as wanting a particular answer. He was also, if he were honest with himself, somewhat short of engagements. "Lugg," he said, without turning from the window. "Still here," said Lugg, from somewhere behind him, in the tone of a man who has been ignored for slightly longer than is professionally justified. "Suffolk. What about it?" "We're going." There was a pause of the kind that precedes either acceptance or a lengthy counter-argument. In Lugg's case, the pause was indistinguishable from either. Eventually he said, "When?" "Tomorrow morning, if I write back this afternoon. We'll stay at whatever passes for an inn in Morcott Pellow." Campion turned away from the window. "Pack sensibly, would you? I mean that with full awareness that it's never worked before, but the spirit of optimism endures." Lugg removed the cold tea from the table. "You read that letter twice," he observed, with the confidence of a man who considers surveillance one of the basic courtesies of domestic service. "3 times," said Campion pleasantly. "The postscript especially. Trouble, is it?" "Almost certainly." He picked up his fountain pen. "Which is why we're going." He wrote the reply at his desk, 2 sentences long and affirmative, and had Lugg post it before noon. By early evening he had looked up Morcott Pellow in 3 separate reference books and found it mentioned with varying degrees of enthusiasm, none of them exceeding mild in 2 of them. A village of approximately 400 souls, a medieval church, some notable agricultural land, and a hall of moderate antiquity. No particular history of violence, which was either reassuring or meant the current instance would be felt all the more keenly by the locals. He closed the last reference book and made a mental note of the name Thurston in connection with the law, because something at the back of his mind suggested a connection he couldn't yet place. Retired solicitor, the letter had implied. A man of settled habits and particular temperament. A man who, apparently, had died in an arrangement that was somehow wrong. Campion was rather interested in the arrangement. The road into Morcott Pellow descended through a corridor of elm trees that had apparently been there since the conquest and intended to remain through whatever came next. Campion's car, a modest thing that Lugg drove, with the concentrated severity of a man steering a barge through difficult shallows, emerged from the tunnel of branches into a village that presented itself with the unhurried confidence of a place that had never needed to advertise. It was the sort of village that appeared on calendars. A green of respectable dimensions anchored the centre, flanked on one side by a public house called the Crown, and on the other by a church of the squat, determined variety that suggested its builders had anticipated bad weather and planned accordingly. Cottages of varying ages lined the approach road in the manner of guests at a function who have arrived at different times and arranged themselves without any agreed principle. A post office cum general store occupied the corner nearest the green, with an air of civic importance somewhat undermined by a handwritten notice in the window advertising last week's parish magazine. Lugg brought the car to a stop at the edge of the green and regarded the scene with the expression of a man who has been promised something and is reserving judgment on whether it has been delivered. "Quiet," he said. "Villages often are," said Campion. "That's generally considered a feature rather than a defect. Depends what's under the quiet." This was, Campion conceded privately, a more perceptive observation than Lugg usually produced before 11 o'clock. He said nothing and got out of the car. The air smelled of leaf mould and something faintly agricultural that the October wind was redistributing with democratic impartiality across the green. 2 women of middle age were conducting a conversation outside the post office with the low-intensity absorption of people discussing something they will still be discussing at supper time. They paused as Campion crossed within their peripheral vision, performed the rapid assessment that villages perform on strangers, and resumed their conversation at a slightly altered frequency. Campion had telephoned ahead. Mrs. Thurston was expecting him at 11, and it was now 20 past, which was close enough to punctual that he did not feel he owed anyone an apology, and far enough past it that he had time to walk the length of the green once before presenting himself. He had always found that a first impression of a place, collected on foot and without apparent purpose, told him considerably more than a directed introduction. The Crown was open. Through its small-paned window he could see the figure of a broad man at the bar, deep in conversation with someone obscured by the frame of the window. The broad man had the slightly overplanted quality of someone who considers the pub his natural habitat and resents anyone else's claim to it. Campion filed him under to be revisited and moved on. The church notice board announced a harvest supper, 3 weeks past, and a flower-arranging rota in which a Mrs. R. Eames featured on alternating Saturdays. A newer notice, handwritten on cream card and pinned with a single tack, asked that the parish keep the Thurston family in their prayers during this difficult time. The wording was precise and impersonal, in the manner of notices drafted by vicars who have learned to navigate loss without inflaming it. Fenwick Hall stood approximately a quarter of a mile beyond the church, reached by a lane that narrowed persuasively as it approached the gates, as though reminding visitors that their arrival was a matter of invitation rather than entitlement. The house itself was Georgian in the main body, with additions at the east wing of a later period that had been constructed with more money than architectural sympathy. It was not a large house by the standards of houses that call themselves halls, but it carried itself with a settled authority, the kind that comes not from grandeur but from simply having been in the same place for a long time. The door was answered before Campion had finished raising his hand to the knocker, which suggested either excellent hearing or a morning spent watching the lane. The woman who opened it was perhaps 40, though she held herself with a composure that made age feel like an irrelevant category. She was dressed in dark grey, not black, which told him the formal period of mourning had been set aside, or possibly had never quite been adopted, and her face had the particular stillness of someone who has been crying recently and has decided, with some effort, to stop. Her eyes were a very clear grey-green, and they examined him with the same careful attention with which she had written her letter. "Mr. Campion," she said. It was not a question. "Mrs. Thurston," he removed his hat. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. The elms took longer than expected." She looked at him for a moment, with the trace of an expression he couldn't immediately classify, something between cautious relief and the wariness of someone who has committed to a course of action, and is only now fully apprehending what that commitment involves. Then she stood aside and let him in. The hallway was wide and smelled of beeswax and old paper, the latter suggesting books in considerable quantity somewhere nearby. A side table held a silver salver containing calling cards, most of them with corners turned down in the manner of recent condolence visits. The arrangement was careful, without being fussy, the arrangement, Campion thought, of a woman who had taken over the organization of a household from someone else's established system, and had done so with tact. "Lug, my associate, will take the car round to wherever is sensible," Campion said, as she closed the door. "He requires very little management, and is almost entirely housebroken. Mrs. Eames will see to it," she said. "She's the housekeeper. She's been here longer than the furniture." She hesitated. "She was here that evening." "Yes?" said Campion. "I thought she might have been." She led him through to a sitting room that was not the drawing room, he noted, the deliberate choice with approval, and poured coffee from a tray that had clearly been waiting some time, which is to say the coffee was no longer at its best, but the gesture was impeccable. They sat at an angle to each other, which was socially more honest than facing directly. "You'll want to know who was here," she said. "In time," said Campion. "First, I'd like you to tell me again, in whatever order things come to you about the feeling. The thing you couldn't name in your letter." She set her cup down. Outside, the wind moved through the garden with a sound like a long, slow exhalation, and somewhere in the upper part of the house, a door settled in its frame. "Reginald," she began, and then paused. He was a precise man, not unkind, precise. Everything had its place. He had his routines in the way other men have religions, and he maintained them with the same quiet fervor. She looked at the window. "When I came into the drawing room that evening and found him, the first thing I noticed, before anything else, before I understood what I was seeing, was that his botanical chart was not where he kept it." Campion set his own cup down with a quietness that was not accidental. "Which chart?" he said. "He kept 3 of them rolled and standing in the tall pottery jar by the side table. He used them when he was working on his specimen notes. They were always in the same order. That evening, when I found him, the middle one was on top." She met his eyes. It had never been the middle one on top, not in 3 years. The room was very still. "Did you mention that to Dr. Prentice?" Campion asked. "I mentioned it to no one," she said. "I thought I was imagining it. I thought grief makes people clutch at small misplacements and call them evidence." A pause. Do you think I was imagining it? Albert Campion looked at her over his spectacles with an expression of such mild and complete attention that she seemed, for a moment, almost startled by it. "No," he said, "I don't think you were imagining it at all." Mrs. Eames was a woman of 63 who had the build of someone who had spent 4 decades lifting things that needed lifting, and the expression of someone who intended to spend the next 4 decades doing the same. She was discovered by Campion in the kitchen, where she was engaged in the serious business of making pastry with the focused application of a person who considers distraction a moral failing. She did not stop when he came in. She regarded him briefly over her floury hands, determined that he was not a threat to the pastry, and returned her attention to the board. "Mrs. Thurston said you'd be wanting a word," she said. "If you can spare one," said Campion pleasantly. He drew out a chair from the kitchen table without asking, and sat down in the manner of a man who finds kitchens entirely congenial. "Don't let me interrupt the important work." Mrs. Eames pressed the heel of her hand into the dough with a force that suggested the dough had recently said something unforgivable. "You're the investigator, then?" "I'm a friend of the family," said Campion, which was the sort of statement that contained just enough truth to be useful without being specific enough to cause complications. "I've been asked to look into 1 or 2 things." About that night. She was quiet for a moment, working the pastry with the rhythm of someone who thinks better when her hands are occupied. The kitchen was warm and smelled of rendered fat and dried herbs, and the window above the sink gave a view of a kitchen garden in its autumn state of dignified neglect, the last of the runner, bean canes, leaning together at odd angles like a committee that had lost confidence in its own purpose. "I've been over it," she said at last. "In my head, many times." "I imagine you have," said Campion. "What time did the guests arrive that evening?" "Mr. Vane was first, always is, 6:30, near enough. Mr. Thurston was in his study still, so Mr. Vane waited in the hall for a few minutes until he was called through." She paused. "Then Miss Galloway and Dr. Prentice came together, which I thought was strange, because they'd come from different directions if they'd come separately, as you'd expect." Campion noted this without expression. "And the 5th guest?" "Mr. and Mrs. Horbury from the village. They came last, around 7. Nice enough people, though Mrs. Horbury talks over her husband something dreadful." She turned the dough and pressed again. "They didn't stay long past 9. First to leave?" "They were." "And Mr. Thurston, how did he seem that evening?" Here Mrs. Eames paused in a way that was different from her previous pauses. The previous pauses had been the pauses of recollection. This one had the quality of something being carefully considered before being offered. "He seemed well enough at first," she said. "In good spirits, I'd have said. He'd had a letter that afternoon that put him in a positive frame of mind. I don't know what was in it, but he came through the kitchen on his way from the post, and he was almost cheerful, which wasn't his usual state. He was a contented man, Mr. Thurston, but cheerful is something different." "It is," agreed Campion. "By 8 o'clock, though, he was quieter. I brought through the drinks myself at 7:30, and he was talking quite freely. When I came back at 8 to see if anything was wanted, he was sitting apart from the others a little, not rudely, but apart." She picked up the rolling pin. "I put it down to tiredness. He tired easily toward the end." "Who was in the drawing room when you brought the drinks through at 7:30? "All of them, to start with." Then Miss Galloway went out to the hall for a few minutes. She said she'd left her cardigan in the coat rack, which seemed unlikely given she was wearing one, and Mr. Thurston stepped out briefly to his study around 20 to 8. He said he'd forgotten something he wanted to show Mr. Vane, papers of some kind. "How long was he gone?" "No more than 5 minutes." She began rolling the pastry with long, even strokes. "Mr. Vane stayed in the drawing room while he was gone. So did Dr. Prentice. Mrs. Horbury was telling a very long story about her sister's kitchen renovation, so I don't think anyone went anywhere during that story, if only because leaving would have required interrupting it. Despite himself, Campion smiled, and when Mr. Thurston returned from his study, he brought the papers and showed them to Mr. Vane. They talked quietly for a while in the corner, which the others didn't join. I couldn't hear what was said, and it's not my place to listen. But Mr. Vane's manner changed after that. He'd been comfortable before, the way he usually is in this house. After those few minutes with Mr. Thurston, he was less so, less comfortable. He laughed too much at Mrs. Horbury's next story, said Mrs. Eames, with the precision of someone who takes social calibration seriously. People who are comfortable don't need to laugh at things they aren't listening to. Campion regarded her with a respect that was entirely genuine. Did Mr. Vane go into the drawing room again after that? I mean, separately at any point when others weren't present? She stopped rolling. The question had snagged something. I can't say for certain, she said slowly. After I brought the second round of drinks through at 8:15, I went back to the kitchen and I was here until Mrs. Thurston called for me at 9:30. She looked at the window. The corridor between the kitchen and the drawing room has a hinge that creaks. I hear people going up and down it, whether I mean to or not. I heard someone in that corridor twice between 8:15 and 9. The first time I assumed it was Mr. Thurston going back to his study. The second time I didn't think about it at all. But you heard it. I heard it, she confirmed. A pause. I don't know whose feet they were. Campion turned his hat slowly on his knee. Outside, the bean canes shifted in the wind, and one of them detached itself from the others and fell at a leisurely angle into the dead soil. You said Mr. Vane was the first to arrive, he said. Was he ever in the drawing room alone before the others came? For a minute or two, while I fetched Mr. Thurston from the study, I put Mr. Vane in the drawing room because that's where guests go. I left him there and went to knock on the study door. She paused again, and this time the pause had a different texture, entirely the texture of someone arriving at a conclusion they hadn't previously assembled in full. That would have been long before supper, of course, long before the brandy was poured. Quite, said Campion, and his voice was entirely neutral. Mr. Thurston always poured his own brandy, she said. Nobody else touched the decanter. He was particular about it. He had a system for the drinks cabinet in the same way he had systems for everything else. She set the rolling pin down and looked at Campion with the direct gaze of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not set out to go. Should I have mentioned these things before? You've mentioned them now, said Campion. That's what counts. He stood and replaced his hat. One more thing. The botanical charts in the tall pottery jar by the side table. Do you know if anyone moved them that evening? Mrs. Ames's expression shifted to something quiet and certain. Mr. Thurston would never have let anyone move those charts. He was very particular. He'd rolled them himself and he kept them in order of use. She folded the edge of her pastry with 4 neat tucks. If they were moved, someone moved them when he wasn't in a position to object. The kitchen was very warm, and the only sound was the thin complaint of the wind at the window glass and the steady, purposeful movement of Mrs. Eames's hands, pressing the pastry into its tin with the unhurried finality of a woman putting everything in its proper place. Campion thanked her and left her to it. In the corridor outside, he stood for a moment and listened. The hinge, as Mrs. Eames had promised, creaked with considerable candour at the lightest pressure. It was not, he thought, the sort of hinge that could be passed through quietly by accident. Passing through it quietly required intention. He walked back toward the sitting room where Mrs. Thurston was waiting, carrying with him the image of a drawing room in which a man's brandy had been poured. A man had briefly left for his study, and someone in his absence had been present, and had not thereafter been entirely willing to say so. Nora Galloway lived in a cottage on the far side of the church, which was close enough to Fenwick Hall to be convenient and far enough to be independent, a balance that Campion suspected had been negotiated rather than arrived at naturally. Mrs. Thurston had provided the address with the careful neutrality of someone describing a geographical fact rather than expressing an opinion, which was itself a form of opinion. The cottage was well kept in the way that suggests effort rather than ease. The window boxes had been planted for autumn with small orange flowers whose name Campion couldn't immediately produce, and the front path had been recently swept with the thoroughness of someone who finds physical activity useful when thinking is proving difficult. A cat of immense self-regard was stationed on the low front wall and watched Campion's approach with the detached assessment of a creature that has long since decided humans are largely beneath serious consideration. He knocked. There was a pause of the particular variety that means someone is inside and deciding whether to answer, and then the door opened, and Nora Galloway stood in the frame, looking at him with eyes that were very bright and very careful. She was perhaps 32, with a quality of energy about her that expressed itself not in movement but in its suppression. Her hands, he noticed immediately, were still at her sides with the deliberate stillness of someone who has told them to be still and is monitoring their compliance. She was dark-haired and had her uncle's jaw, which is to say a jaw built for conclusions, though the conclusions it was currently suggesting were mostly defensive. "Miss Galloway," said Campion. "My name is Campion. Mrs. Thurston asked if you'd speak with me." "She telephoned," said Nora. "Yes? Come in." She stood aside with a grace that was not entirely relaxed and led him through to a small sitting room furnished with the eclectic confidence of someone whose taste is genuine but whose budget is finite. There were good things mixed with modest things, and all of it arranged with an eye that knew the difference. A small watercolor above the fireplace countryside, competently rendered, and on the shelf beside it, a gap where something had recently stood that was no longer there. Campion noted the gap and said nothing about it. "Tea?" she asked. "Only if you're having some." She wasn't, but she went to make it anyway, which gave them both a moment. When she returned with a tray that rattled very slightly in transit, not because the cups were badly placed, Campion judged, but because her hands were not as still as she was asking them to be, she sat across from him in an armchair that was clearly her usual chair, and crossed her ankles and looked at him directly. "You're not a policeman," she said. "No. Dorothea said you were a family friend. That's a serviceable description." "It's a vague one," said Nora, with the bluntness of someone who has been carefully worded at and is tired of it. "What is it you actually want to know?" Campion poured his own tea without being invited to, which had the intended effect of making the exchange feel slightly less formal. "I'd like to understand the evening," he said. "Not the official version, the version you experienced, what the room felt like, what people said, and how they said it." Something in her posture shifted. It was not a relaxation exactly. It was more the adjustment of someone who has been prepared for one kind of conversation and finds themselves in a different one. "It felt like most evenings at Fenwick Hall," she said. Uncle Reginald was a good host in the sense that he ensured people had drinks and a comfortable chair and enough conversational material. He wasn't warm, precisely, but he was attentive. "Were you close to him?" The question landed with a weight that was deliberately gentle. She received it carefully. "We had been closer," she said. "More recently, there had been a distance, a disagreement about the will." She looked at him sharply. "Dorothea told you." "Nobody told me anything specific," said Campion. "But you said a disagreement. And the construction of sentences like that in families generally involves either money or property. And since you're here in a cottage, rather than at the hall, property has a certain relevance." The hands moved then, briefly one rising to push a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that had nothing to do with hair. "He changed the will," she said. 8 months ago. I'm not in it anymore, he found out, about the Pemberton chair. She said this last phrase in the tone of someone confessing a thing they have rehearsed confessing and still find uncomfortable. "A Hepplewhite chair from the morning room. I sold it. I needed money and I thought it was a foolish thought and I was wrong and he found out and that was that. Did you discuss it with him? Once, briefly. He was not a man who revisited decisions once made. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact, which told him more than distress would have. She had processed this. It had been processed at considerable internal cost. I was still invited to family evenings because Reginald was not a man who conducted his disapprovals publicly. Everything continued, as before on the surface. Just the will had changed. Who else knew the will had changed? Geoffrey Vane, she said, without hesitation. Uncle Reginald told him, I think. They were close in that way, business confidants. A pause. And Dr. Prentice knew. Dr. Prentice, said Campion conversationally. Your uncle's GP? Yes. The word was given a beat too quickly, and then a beat too much silence followed it. Campion let the silence run. It ran for a count of approximately 4 before she added, He's been the family doctor here for years. Of course, said Campion agreeably. He redirected. That evening, you stepped out of the drawing room at some point. Mrs. Eames mentioned you'd gone to the coat rack for your cardigan. Nora Galloway's eyes, which had been maintaining steady contact with reasonable success, moved left and then returned. The movement was small and involuntary, and she was immediately aware that he'd seen it. Yes, she said, I'd felt cold. But you were wearing a cardigan when you arrived, said Campion not unkindly. The silence this time had a different quality. It was not the silence of someone composing a lie. It was the silence of someone deciding how much truth to spend. I wanted to look at the snuff box, she said at last, in the hall cabinet. It was my grandmother's originally, and it was I had been thinking about it. I wasn't going to take it. She said this last sentence with a firmness that suggested she was aware of how it sounded, given recent history. I simply wanted to look at it. I knew I wasn't in the will anymore, and I thought it might be the last time the house was accessible to me in an informal way. And I just wanted to look at it. She took a breath. I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone who is sorry for something and trying not to make it worse, said Campion. How long were you in the hall? 4 minutes, perhaps 5. I heard Mr. Thurston come out of the drawing room and go to his study, so I went back to the drawing room before he returned. I didn't want him to find me in the hall. Who was in the drawing room when you returned? Mr. Vane and Dr. Prentice. Mrs. Horbury was there also. She thought, Mr. Horbury had gone out to the corridor briefly, he smokes, and Uncle Reginald didn't permit it indoors. Campion set down his cup. The map of the evening was becoming, if not clear, then at least navigable. People moving in and out of rooms in the ordinary way of social evenings, each absence perfectly explainable, none of them necessarily innocent. Miss Galloway, he said, when your uncle poured his brandy that evening, did you see him do it? Yes. He always poured his own, around 8:30. He had a particular glass crystal, a gift that he used every evening. And after he poured it, did the glass remain where he left it? On the side table, I mean, near the botanical charts. She went very still. Not the managed stillness of the first meeting, but the stillness of someone in whom a penny has taken a long time to drop and has now, quietly and irrevocably, landed. I don't know, she said. I wasn't watching the glass. She looked at him. Should I have been watching the glass? Nobody knew to watch it at the time, said Campion gently. That's rather the point. He stood and straightened his jacket. You've been very helpful. Have I? The question was not rhetorical. She genuinely appeared uncertain what she had given him and what the giving of it meant. More than you know, he said, and he meant it with complete sincerity, though the sincerity contained elements he had no intention of unpacking in her sitting room. At the door, he paused. The snuff box, he said, turning back. Is it still in the hall cabinet at Fenwick Hall? She held his gaze steadily. Yes, she said. I told you. I only looked at it. Good, said Campion, and stepped out into the cold afternoon, where the cat on the wall turned its back on him with the immense dignity of a creature that has heard everything and intends to report none of it. The Crown revealed itself, upon entry, to be the kind of public house that has resisted improvement with the quiet stubbornness of a man who has been offered better chairs and prefers his own. The ceiling was low and darkened by decades of accumulated atmosphere. The floor was flagged with uneven stones that had long since defeated any ambition toward level, and the bar itself was a construction of considerable age and minor magnificence, presided over by a landlord of 50 or so who had the measured, watchful manner of a man who has heard most things twice and forgotten nothing. Campion arrived at 12:20, which is the hour at which a village pub absorbs its first serious wave of the day. Two farmers occupied the bench nearest the fire, with the territorial comfort of men who have occupied the same bench for so long that it has effectively become theirs under common law. A younger man in muddy boots sat alone at a table near the window studying his telephone with the focused unhappiness of someone waiting for a message that has not arrived and probably isn't going to. Geoffrey Vane was at the bar. Campion had been given a description by Mrs. Thurston: broad, fair, convivial, and the description was accurate as far as it went, which was not very far because it missed the quality that Campion noticed first. Vane was a man who took up space with great deliberateness, not in the aggressive manner of someone asserting himself, but in the more calculated manner of someone who has decided that physical ease and social confidence are the same thing and has arranged himself accordingly. He was perhaps 55, with fair hair going to silver at the temples and a face that was handsome in the way of faces that have been presented at their best advantage. For so long the habit has become structural. He was laughing at something the landlord had said when Campion came in, and the laugh was very good, warm and full, and entirely without the self-consciousness that ruins most public laughter. It was, Campion reflected, the laugh of a man who had practiced it. He ordered a half of bitter and positioned himself 2 stools along the bar with the ease of someone who finds bars entirely natural, and waited for the ordinary mechanics of public house sociability to do their work. They did not take long. Vane clocked him within 90 seconds, the stranger assessment swifter and more professional than the one the women outside the post office had performed, and by the time Campion had taken his first sip, the 2 stools between them had been philosophically reduced to 1. "Passing through," said Vane. His voice was easy and moderately well-educated, with the faint residue of a regional accent that had been largely, but not entirely, smoothed away. "Visiting," said Campion. "Friend of the Thurston family. Campion." He said it without emphasis, and watched. Vane received the name with a slight broadening of the smile and a fractional stilling of the glass in his hand, both movements together, lasting perhaps 1/3 of a second, and both entirely controlled. He was good, Campion thought. He was genuinely good. "Vane," he said, extending his hand. "Geoffrey Vane. I was a close friend of Reginald's. Dreadful business. Are you up from London?" "Yesterday," said Campion. "I'm staying at the inn on the Ipswich road. Mrs. Thurston was kind enough to write and ask if I'd come. She's finding it difficult." "Of course she is." Vane's sympathy was impeccable. "Dorothea is a remarkable woman. She's been enormously composed, which I suspect is costing her more than anyone knows." He took a considered sip of his drink. "Were you and Reginald close?" "We moved in overlapping circles," said Campion, which had the advantage of being unverifiable. "I knew him well enough to admire him. He had a very particular mind. Precise." "Precise is exactly right," said Vane, with the warmth of the sincerely seconded opinion. He was a solicitor for 30 years, and it showed. Not in a dry way, in a good way. He noticed things, remembered details. Something moved very briefly behind the geniality. He could be stubborn with it, of course. Once he'd formed a view, shifting him was hard going. "As with all precise men," said Campion agreeably. "I suppose in business that quality has advantages and disadvantages in roughly equal measure." "Quite so," said Vane. You have to know when to hold a position and when to negotiate. Reginald occasionally held positions longer than was strictly productive. Were you in business together? The question was entirely natural in the context of the conversation, and Vane answered it naturally. A land venture, agricultural parcels east of the village. We'd been partners in it for about 3 years. A modest enough thing, but sound. He set his glass down. I'm in the process now of working out how to proceed without him, which isn't straightforward when there are shared instruments involved. Dorothea has very little interest in agricultural land, understandably. No, I imagine not, said Campion. Was the venture going well? At the time, I mean. Before. Steadily, said Vane. There was nothing in the word itself. The steadiness of the word was the thing. It was too steady, the word of a man hitting a note he has rehearsed in the key of casual. Land of that type appreciates slowly, but reliably. We weren't expecting dramatic returns. No dramatic difficulties either, I hope, said Campion, and smiled in the manner of someone making conversation rather than asking questions. Vane smiled back with equal pleasantness. None worth mentioning, he said. They drank in companionable silence for a moment. Around them the pub continued its noon life, the farmers debating something agricultural of their own. The young man by the window having apparently resolved his telephone situation to either satisfaction or despair, a woman coming in to collect a sandwich order that had been prepared by someone in the back who communicated only through a serving hatch. "You were there that evening, I believe," said Campion presently. "At Fenwick Hall." "I was," said Vane. The geniality held without visible effort. "I've been over it many times since. It's difficult to accept that an evening you experienced as perfectly ordinary was, in fact, the last evening. The mind wants to have noticed something. It generally didn't." "What time did you leave?" "Shortly after 9. I had an early start the following morning. I drove up to Berry Street. Edmund's at 6 for a meeting." He paused, with the precision of someone illustrating their own alibi without being asked to Mr. and Mrs. "Horbury left at roughly the same time. We walked out together as far as the lane." "And Reginald was well when you left?" Something very particular happened to Vane's face. It was not a flinch exactly, and it was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man on whom an exact question has landed in an exact place, a man who is prepared for questions about the evening in general and finds a specific one requiring a specific gear change. "He'd been quieter than usual in the latter part of the evening," said Vane. "I noticed it, but put it down to tiredness. His health had been variable." He lifted his glass. With hindsight, of course, one reads more into these things than one should. "I'm sure," said Campion. "Did anything in particular seem to concern him? Any topic of conversation that he seemed preoccupied by?" "Not that I recall," said Vane evenly. This, Campion noted, was the first clean lie of the conversation. It sat in the sentence like a smooth stone in a stream placed there, not natural to it. Mrs. Eames had been explicit. Thurston had shown Vane papers from his study, and after the showing of those papers, Vane had laughed too much at Mrs. Horbury's stories. A man who had been shown papers he found comfortable had no reason to laugh too much. A man who had been shown papers that frightened him had every reason to fill subsequent silence with as much noise as available. Campion finished his half of bitter and made no move to order another, which, in the arithmetic of pub conversation, signals a conclusion approaching. "You're very kind to speak with me," he said. "I think Dorothea simply needs to understand the evening a little better. She wasn't able to say goodbye properly, and that sort of thing unsettles people." He settled off the stool. "Grief takes unusual forms sometimes." "It does," agreed Vane. His composure was intact. Every surface was intact. "Please do give her my best. I've called twice since the funeral, but one doesn't want to intrude." "Quite right," said Campion. He buttoned his coat. "One final thing, and forgive me for it. Did you happen to go back into the drawing room at any point during the evening? After the group had dispersed a little, I only ask because Mrs. Thurston is trying to reconstruct the sequence of events for her own peace of mind. The pause before Vane's answer lasted exactly 1 second longer than it ought. No, he said. I stayed with the group throughout. I'm quite sure of it. Campion looked at him with the expression of a man receiving a satisfactory answer to an unimportant question. Marvelous, he said warmly. That does help to clarify the picture. He nodded pleasantly to the landlord and walked to the door. Behind him he heard Vane's glass meet the bar with the careful, deliberate placement of a man, ensuring his hands are doing exactly what he intends, and nothing else. Campion stepped out into the cold air of the village and stood for a moment on the pavement, considering the quality of that final pause. 1 second. It was, in its way, rather a long time. Dr. Prentice's surgery occupied the ground floor of a double-fronted house on the lane, running north from the green, a position that gave it the mild civic authority of a building that has been useful to the community for long enough to feel entitled to its prominence. A hand-painted sign by the gate announced surgery hours in lettering that had once been black and was now a considered shade of grey, which told Campion something about the doctor's relationship with maintenance, or possibly with permanence. He arrived at 2 o'clock, outside surgery hours by design, and knocked at the side door marked private rather than the front entrance, which had the intended effect of producing Dr. Prentice himself rather than a receptionist. The doctor opened the door with the expression of a man expecting a delivery and receiving instead a social complication. He was 50, lean in the way that some men become lean after 40 when anxiety outpaces appetite, with dark hair greying in patches and the kind of face that had once been open and was now in the process of becoming guarded without having fully committed to the transition. His eyes were intelligent and restless, and they moved over Campion in the first second with a clinical efficiency that was clearly habitual and almost certainly involuntary. "Mr. Campion," he said. So Mrs. Thurston had telephoned ahead again, or the village had, which in small communities amounted to the same thing. "You'd better come in." The private entrance led through a narrow hall into a sitting room that doubled, by the look of it, as a secondary consulting space for conversations that required a sofa rather than a desk. Medical journals occupied one shelf with the orderly resignation of things that are subscribed to and not read, and on the desk in the corner a half-finished letter had been turned face down, with a promptness that suggested Campion's arrival had interrupted its composition. "I've spoken to Dorothea," said Dr. Prentice, before Campion had sat down. He remained standing himself, which was a choice. "She's told me why you're here, more or less. I want to say clearly that I understand her need to process what happened, in whatever way helps her. Grief is not rational. I don't say that dismissively." "No," said Campion, settling comfortably into the offered chair, as though the doctor's standing presented no conversational inconvenience whatsoever. "It's a reasonable observation. You've known her long?" 3 years, since she married Reginald." Prentice moved to the window and stood with his back partially to it, which put his face in mild shadow, a positioning Campion suspected was not entirely accidental. "I was Reginald's doctor for 4 years before that. I knew him well." "His heart condition," said Campion. "Atrial fibrillation with associated ventricular weakness. Diagnosed 4 years ago, managed with medication, monitored regularly. It was serious, but stable." He said this with the crisp authority of a man reciting credentials. His death, while sudden, was not medically surprising. "I have no hesitation about the certificate." "No one is questioning the certificate," said Campion mildly. "Then what is being questioned?" The sharpness came out too fast, and Prentice heard it himself and adjusted. "Forgive me. I've found this whole fortnight difficult. Reginald was a patient and a neighbour, and I feel his loss personally. When Dorothea writes to consultants in London," he stopped. "She wrote to a friend," said Campion pleasantly. "Not a consultant. I have no official standing of any kind. I'm simply asking questions to help a grieving woman understand the last evening of her husband's life. There's nothing in that which should concern anyone whose conscience is clear. The sentence was constructed with considerable care, and Prentice received each component of it with the wariness it deserved. He came away from the window and sat down at last, which made the room feel slightly less like a tribunal. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Tell me about the evening, your impression of it." Prentice laced his fingers together on his knee and looked at the middle distance in the manner of someone consulting an internal transcript. It was a routine social gathering. Reginald hosted these things perhaps once a month, the same group, more or less. Himself and Dorothea, myself, Nora Galloway, Geoffrey Vane, and that evening the Horburys were there as well. We had drinks, conversation. The Horburys left around 9, and I left perhaps 20 minutes after. And Reginald's state during the evening? He was in reasonable spirits initially. A pause. I noticed toward 8 o'clock that he was more subdued. I put it down to the medication. One of the drugs he was taking can affect energy levels in the evening. It was nothing that alarmed me clinically. Did he mention feeling unwell? He didn't. He wasn't the type to. Reginald's view of physical discomfort was that announcing it constituted a form of weakness, which is not an attitude I encouraged professionally, but it was deeply embedded. The faintest dry note entered his voice at this. He would have felt it a social discourtesy to feel ill at his own gathering. "Quite," said Campion. "And Miss Galloway, she was well that evening? In good spirits herself?" The change in Prentice was a small masterpiece of involuntary disclosure. He had been sitting with the measured stillness of a careful man, and something in the mention of Nora's name redistributed his stillness in a way that was visible in the hands first, a slight relacing of the fingers, and then in the jaw, which made a small, almost imperceptible adjustment. "She seemed her usual self," he said. "You see a good deal of her?" said Campion, with the vague interest of someone asking about a mutual acquaintance. "She's a patient." The words were exact and closed, like a door shutting firmly without slamming, the technique of someone who has had practice with this particular door. "Of course," said Campion. "I only ask because she mentioned that you'd arrived together that evening, which is to say, at the same time. From different directions," Mrs. Eames thought. "We happened to arrive simultaneously," said Prentice. "The lane is narrow. We walked the last bit from the gate together." He met Campion's gaze with something that was not quite defiance and not quite appeal. "There's nothing in that." "I'm sure there isn't," said Campion with complete apparent sincerity. "Tell me the medication Reginald was taking, the one affecting evening energy levels. What was the compound?" Prentice named it, a beta blocker, with the fluency of reflex. Then, 3 seconds later, something shifted behind his eyes, a delayed recognition, the moment a man realizes he's been led somewhere without noticing the path. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Simple curiosity about his general health picture," said Campion. "Nothing more technical than that." He smiled. "I want to understand what sort of man he was in his final weeks, whether he was comfortable, whether he had concerns." "He had concerns," said Prentice, after a moment. The word sat there with more weight than the doctor had apparently intended to give it, and he seemed briefly aware of this. He was a man with business affairs and personal affairs. Like anyone, he'd had some family difficulty regarding the will. He'd mentioned to me that one of his partnerships was not quite as he'd hoped. He stopped. "That's all general, nothing specific." "Which partnership?" said Campion. "I don't know the details." He didn't share details. He simply said, once, that he'd found something in the accounts that disappointed him. Prentice stood up, which was clearly intended as a signal that the interview was reaching its natural boundary. I assumed it was the land thing with Vane, but that was inference on my part. Reginald didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. "When was this?" 3 weeks before he died." Prentice held the door with the quiet authority of a GP who has concluded an appointment. "Mr. Campion, I want to be helpful to Dorothea." "I do." But I also want to be honest with you. I signed that death certificate because I believed it was correct. I still believe it. Reginald Thurston died of cardiac failure. Everything I observed that evening is consistent with that conclusion. I don't doubt that everything you observed is consistent with it, said Campion, rising. The interesting question isn't always what the evidence is consistent with, it's whether the evidence is complete. He retrieved his hat from the side table. Prentice watched him with an expression that had moved over the course of the conversation, from defensive competence to something that was closer to unease, not the unease of a man with a great deal to hide, Campion thought, but the unease of a man who has begun to suspect he may have missed something, and who is not yet certain whether that missing was innocent or consequential. At the gate, Campion paused and turned. "One last thing," he said. "The medication Reginald was taking. Was it the only preparation you'd prescribed for his cardiac condition?" "He was also on a low-dose anticoagulant," said Prentice. "Standard for his profile. Nothing else?" "Nothing else from me." The qualifying phrase was out before he could reconsider it, and both men heard it with equal clarity. From me. 3 words that drew a boundary that had not previously been visible, a boundary that suggested, with quiet precision, that the space on the other side of it was not empty. Campion thanked him and walked back toward the green, where the afternoon light had turned the color of cold tea and the elm trees at the village edge were moving in a wind that had picked up since morning. He turned the phrase over as he walked. Nothing else from me. Prentice had not lied. Campion was fairly certain of that. The doctor had answered every question honestly within the limits of what he knew. But limits, as Campion had long understood, are themselves a form of information. The shape of what a man does not know tells you, with some precision, the shape of what someone else has been careful to keep from him. He walked back past the post office, where a different woman was now engaged in a different conversation with the same quality of inexhaustible local interest, and thought about digitalis, which grows in hedgerows and gardens throughout Suffolk, and which any man with a botanical library and 3 years of careful observation would have in his specimen collection, neatly labelled, in a tall pottery jar beside a side table, in a room where brandy was poured and briefly left unattended, on an evening in October when everyone had been, in one way or another, briefly somewhere else. Mrs. Thurston was waiting for him in the hall when he returned to Fenwick Hall, which told him she had been watching the lane and had not wanted him to know she was watching the lane since she met him at the door with the composed expression of someone who had been doing something else entirely and happened to be passing. He did not remark on it. She asked if he would like to see the drawing room, and he said that he would, which was why he had come back, though he said it as though the idea had just now presented itself as a pleasant possibility. The drawing room was at the rear of the house, looking onto the garden. She opened the door and stood aside in the manner of someone who has not entered the room since the evening in question and has no particular wish to enter it now, but is too composed to say so. Campion went in alone. It was a room of moderate size and considerable character, furnished across several decades with the unself-conscious accumulation of a household that buys things because it likes them rather than because they complement one another. 2 armchairs of different periods flanked the fireplace, a sofa occupied the wall beneath the window, and a writing desk in the far corner had been pressed into service as an overflow surface for the books that had exceeded their allotted shelving elsewhere. The shelving itself ran along the north wall in 2 sections, interrupted at the center by a cabinet of shallow drawers that had the purposeful look of a thing designed for storing flat, valuable things, maps, perhaps, or documents, or the botanical charts, whose significance Campion had been carrying since breakfast. He stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked, because the first look at a room is the only one that cannot be repeated. After it, you are no longer seeing the room, you are seeing your own accumulating interpretation of it, which is a different and less reliable thing. The pottery jar stood on the side table, exactly where Mrs. Thurston had described it. It was a tall, cylindrical piece in terracotta, glazed a deep blue-green, and it held 3 rolled charts bound with different-colored ribbon, one red, one green, one white. They were standing in the order red, white, green, from front to back. He moved to the side table and examined them without touching, then looked at the table surface itself. The surface was dust-free, which meant Mrs. Eames had continued cleaning the room despite its unoccupied status, an act of either professional diligence or deliberate preservation. Near the jar, a small circular mark on the polished wood feint, the kind left by a glass or the base of a vessel that has been set down repeatedly in the same place, sat approximately 8 inches from the jar's base. That was where the brandy glass lived. Not where it had been found, necessarily, but where it lived as a matter of routine. Campion crouched and examined the mark at eye level. Around it, at perhaps 4 inches distance, was a second mark, fainter and less perfectly circular, suggesting something had been placed near the glass's habitual position at some point, perhaps often, perhaps only once. He straightened up and turned his attention to the drinks cabinet against the wall behind the door. It was an Edwardian piece, modest but well preserved, with a hinged top that lifted to reveal a fitted interior. The brandy decanter was present, its level indicating a bottle perhaps 2/3 consumed. He lifted the stopper and smelled it, which was not conclusive, because digitalis in extracted solution, administered at the level required to accelerate an already compromised cardiac event, has no detectable odor appreciable to the human nose, and still less to one filtered through a room's worth of afternoon air. He replaced the stopper with the equanimity of a man who has confirmed a negative result, which is still a result. The botanical specimens occupied the lower shelf of the north bookcase, arranged with a rigor that was immediately evident. Each specimen was mounted on cardstock and covered with a slip of clear material, with a handwritten label beneath identifying the plant, its Latin designation, its collection date, and its location. They were arranged alphabetically and were, Campion noted, entirely undisturbed. He ran his eye along them with the attention of someone who is not a botanist but understands systems, looking not for what was there but for what had been there and was no longer. He found it between Datura stramonium and Digitalis grandiflora, a small gap, barely a centimetre, where the specimens were pressed together without quite meeting, the gap of an absent card. The cards on either side had shifted infinitesimally toward each other, the way books on a shelf drift toward a vacancy. It was the kind of gap that announces an absence only to someone specifically looking for one. He crouched again and examined the shelf. On the edge of the wood, caught in the small ridge where the shelf met the bookcase back, was a fragment of cardstock no bigger than a thumbnail, pale cream, with 2 letters visible in Thurston's precise handwriting, D. The beginning of Digitalis purpurea, the common foxglove, which is the plant from which Digitalis glycoside is obtained, and which, if one possesses a specimen collection and a modest knowledge of extraction, provides both the material and its theoretical application in a single convenient location. Campion left the fragment where it was. He moved to the sofa and sat down, not because he was tired, but because the perspective from the sofa was the perspective of a guest, and he wanted to understand the room as a guest would have occupied it. From here, the side table was visible, but not prominently so. The brandy glass, when standing in its habitual position, would have been partially obscured by the pottery jar to anyone seated at the sofa's far end. From the nearer end, by the armchair, it would have been visible at a glance. He noted which chair was positioned at what distance from the table, and considered which chair Geoffrey Vane would most naturally have occupied as the first guest to arrive and the man most familiar with the room's geography. Then he turned his attention to the charts again. Red, white, green. He needed to know their original order, and he needed to know it from someone who had not been in the room on the night in question and had no stake in the answer. He returned to the hallway, where Mrs. Thurston was demonstrably not waiting by the door. "The botanical charts," he said, "in the blue-green jar. Can you tell me what order Reginald kept them in?" She thought for a moment, with the careful honesty of someone who wants to be accurate. "Green in front," she said, "then red, then white at the back. He always said it was the order he used them, the green one most often, then the others." She paused. "He was very particular about it." "He was," agreed Campion. The charts, as he had found them, read red, white, green. The most used chart, the green, was now at the back. Someone had returned them to the jar in the wrong order in a hurry, or by someone unfamiliar with the system, or both. The act of returning them had been done conscientiously enough to avoid leaving them on the table, but quickly enough that the order had been abandoned. He asked one more question. "When you came into the drawing-room that evening and found Reginald, where was his brandy glass?" Mrs. Thurston's composure held, but only just. "On the floor beside his chair," she said. "He'd knocked it over, I think, when he fell. There was a small spill on the rug." She stopped. Mrs. Eames cleaned it. "Of course she did," said Campion, gently. "And the glass itself?" "She washed it. The following morning." She was trying to be helpful. A pause of considerable complexity. Was that important?" Campion looked at her with the expression of a man forming the careful boundary between what he knows and what it is useful, at this moment, to say. "What's important right now," he said, "is that you are quite right. Something was wrong in the drawing-room." He said it simply and without theatre. "I want you to hold that knowledge for a little longer while I confirm the shape of it. Can you do that?" She met his eyes steadily, and the grey-green of them was very clear in the afternoon light coming through the hall window. "I've been holding it for a fortnight already," she said. "A little longer is perfectly manageable." He nodded. Outside, a car passed on the lane, and the elm trees moved at the edge of the garden with the slow patience of things that have stood in one place long enough to understand that the important events always, eventually, come to them. Campion put on his hat and went out into the fading afternoon, carrying with him the memory of a gap on a shelf, a chart returned in the wrong order, and a brandy glass that had been washed clean before anyone thought to ask what it might have contained. The vicarage tea had been arranged, Mrs. Thurston explained the following morning, before Campion's arrival in Morcott Pellow, and well before anyone had thought to call it anything other than what it was, a gathering of the sort that villages conduct regularly and without particular occasion, the social equivalent of routine maintenance. The Reverend Aubrey Marsh held these teas on the third Thursday of the month, and the third Thursday had arrived with the punctual indifference of calendar dates to human inconvenience. Mrs. Thurston had been invited before Reginald died, and had decided, upon consideration, to attend. She mentioned this to Campion at breakfast, with the slightly defensive precision of someone anticipating an opinion that has not been offered. He offered none. He asked instead whether he might accompany her, which she received with a relief she tried not to make too visible. Lugg, who had spent the previous day conducting his own investigations in the manner of a large man, making himself agreeable in a pub while appearing to do nothing of the kind, had returned to the inn the previous evening with the smell of the Crown about him and the satisfied expression of someone who has been considerably more productive than his demeanour suggests. He had delivered his findings to Campion in the economical style of a man who knows which details matter and cannot always be relied upon to present them in their correct order. "Land deal," he'd said, removing his coat with the deliberation of a man who considers his coat removal a preamble to serious speech. Common knowledge at the bar that Vane's been the active manager of it. Thurston put in the capital. Vane ran the operation. 3 parcels east of the village, rented to 2 tenant farmers. Money comes in quarterly. He settled into the chair opposite. Thing is, the farmers at the bar, the 2 that were in there at noon, them by the fire, they reckon the quarterly returns have been considerably better than what Vane's been reporting to the partnership accounts. One of them mentioned it because he'd heard Vane bought a new car in August, a considerable car. How considerably better? Campion had asked. Enough to buy a considerable car, said Lugg, with the precision of a man who considers this sufficient. It was, Campion had agreed, sufficient. The vicarage was a Victorian building of good intention and moderate comfort, positioned beside the church with the loyal proximity of a faithful institution. Its interior, as Campion discovered upon entering behind Mrs. Thurston at 3:30, had been arranged for the tea with the cheerful imprecision of a household that owns a great many small tables and is not always certain where to put them. Chairs of 4 different styles occupied the main reception room, and a long table against the wall bore the tea things, a generous spread of sandwiches, fruitcake, scones, and what appeared to be a Victoria sponge of remarkable structural confidence. The Reverend Marsh was a man of 60 with white hair, and the particular openness of expression that belongs to people who have spent decades being professionally interested in other people's inner lives. He greeted Mrs. Thurston with a warmth that was genuine and undemonstrative, and Campion with the interested courtesy of a man who has heard that a visitor is in the village and been curious in a perfectly charitable way about the reason. The room, by the time Campion and Mrs. Thurston arrived, contained 7 other people. The Horburys were present, a small, neat woman of energetic opinion and a taller, quieter man who moved with the resigned precision of someone long accustomed to providing the full stop at the end of his wife's sentences. Nora Galloway was there, seated near the window with a cup held in both hands and a posture of maintained composure that Campion recognized from their earlier meeting. Dr. Prentice stood near the bookshelf with the self-contained wariness of a man who has been thinking continuously since a recent conversation and has not yet resolved where the thinking leads. Geoffrey Vane was at the table, selecting a sandwich with the unconcerned ease of a man at a social function he attends regularly and enjoys without complication. He looked up when Campion came in, and the look lasted a fraction of a second longer than it would have if their pub conversation had been entirely comfortable. Then the good smile reassembled itself, and he raised his plate in the manner of a sociable greeting. Campion circulated. This was always the productive phase, not the seated conversation, which has structure and visible intent, but the standing, drifting, cup and saucer phase in which people say things sideways, their attention never quite fully on any single exchange. He talked to Mr. Horbury first, who was refreshingly direct in the way of quiet men who are occasionally given an opening and make considered use of it. "Dreadful thing about Reginald," said Horbury, into his tea, though not entirely surprising given the heart. "Did you know him well?" asked Campion. "Well enough. We'd been to his evenings 6 or 7 times. Decent man, very organized." He paused in a way that suggested he was not finished. "My wife thought the world of him. I thought he was a man carrying something heavier than he let on." "In what sense?" "The last month or so, he had the look of a man who has been given information he's working out what to do with." Horbury turned his cup in its saucer. "I asked him once, the week before the evening, whether everything was all right. We'd passed each other on the lane. He said everything was perfectly fine and changed the subject to the weather, which is generally considered conclusive evidence that everything is not perfectly fine." Campion thanked him and moved on toward Mrs. Marsh, the vicar's wife, who was refilling the hot water jug and conducting a simultaneous conversation with Mrs. Horbury about the harvest supper accounts, a subject that appeared to contain several layers of unresolved tension beneath its agricultural surface. He waited for a pause in the account dispute and stepped into it with the amiable ease of a man carrying an empty cup. Mrs. Marsh was a small, quick-eyed woman of 55 with the specific social intelligence of a vicar's wife who has spent 30 years noticing things in rooms and knowing which of them to mention and which to place carefully in the category of things observed but not spoken. She looked at Campion with precisely that intelligence and offered him tea with the warmth of someone who has already made a provisional assessment and found it broadly favourable. "We're all very glad Dorothea has a friend staying," she said, which told him that the village had formed an opinion about his presence, and that the opinion was, at least officially, benign. "She's managing remarkably well," said Campion. "She is," said Mrs. Marsh, "though I'm not certain that managing remarkably well is always the same as being all right." She poured with the steady hand of someone making a point that doesn't need emphasis. "Reginald's evenings were always pleasant, you know. We attended 2 or 3 times. He was an excellent host, very precise about his arrangements." She paused, then added with the casualness of someone relaying a detail that probably doesn't matter, that last evening, the night he died, Aubrey saw Geoffrey Vane on the lane as he was taking his evening walk, which would have been around 8:45 or so. Aubrey walks at the same time every evening. He's terribly reliable about it. He thought it odd at the time. Campion kept his expression in the register of polite interest. "Odd in what way?" "Well, Mr. Vane was coming from the direction of Fenwick Hall, which in itself isn't odd. He'd been there for the evening, obviously. But Aubrey said he looked— how did he put it? He said Vane looked as though he was walking deliberately, slowly, which Aubrey found odd because it was cold, and Mr. Vane is not generally a slow walker." She set the teapot down. "He also said he thought Mr. Vane's overcoat was on the wrong button, which may be nothing. One does up one's coat in the dark. But Aubrey notices these things because he's a details man." She smiled with the modesty of someone mentioning a trifle that has, perhaps, not been entirely trifling. Campion thanked her for the tea. Across the room he could see Vane talking to Nora Galloway, both of them in the posture of people having a surface conversation about one thing while conducting a different conversation underneath it. Prentice was watching them from the bookshelf with an expression that cost him something to maintain in its current configuration of neutrality. The vicar appeared at Campion's elbow with the quiet materialization of a man accustomed to entering spaces without disruption. "I understand you're here to help Dorothea," he said, in the low register of a private exchange. "I'm trying to," said Campion. "The lane," said the vicar, and then stopped, as though weighing something. "When I saw Geoffrey that evening, I nodded to him. He nodded back. But he didn't stop, which he usually does. Geoffrey is a stopping and chatting man in ordinary circumstances. He looked at the room rather than at Campion. That evening he kept walking, quite steadily, looking forward, a man concentrating on something. He picked up a scone from the passing plate offered by his wife. I thought about it afterward, and I thought I ought to mention it to someone. I wasn't sure to whom. "You've mentioned it to the right person," said Campion. He stayed for another 40 minutes, eating a sandwich he didn't particularly want, and talking about the village's medieval church, the harvest results, and the general insufficiency of public transport in rural Suffolk. Vane left at 4:15 with a round of warm farewells and the manner of a man departing on perfectly comfortable terms with all present. Campion watched him go and observed that the perfectly comfortable terms required, from Vane's side, a consistent, low-level effort that a truly comfortable man would not have needed to supply. Walking back to Fenwick Hall afterward with Mrs. Thurston beside him in the cooling dusk, Campion said nothing for a considerable distance. The lane was quiet, and the elms made their usual dignified commentary overhead. "You learned something," said Mrs. Thurston. "It was not a question." "Several things," said Campion, "including the fact that your husband was seen returning to the lane toward 9 o'clock by the vicar, which is perfectly consistent with what we knew." He paused. "And that, Mr. Vane appears to have left, and possibly returned at a time that is not quite consistent with what he told me." She absorbed this without speaking. The gravel of the Fenwick Hall drive crunched under their feet, and the house presented itself at the end of the approach, dark against the paler dark of the sky, patient and settled and waiting, as all houses wait, for the people inside them to finish what has been started. Campion sat at the small writing desk in his room at the inn on the Ipswich Road, and arranged what he knew in the order in which it had been given to him, which is never the order in which it is true. Outside, the village had settled into its evening configuration, the particular quiet of a rural October night that is not silence, but the layered accumulation of small sounds, wind in the elms, a dog at some distance conducting a one-sided argument with something, the occasional passage of a car on the main road that had not slowed for the village in any meaningful way since the bypass opened in 1987. He had a notepad in front of him, which he rarely wrote on, and a cold cup of tea beside him, which he occasionally consulted without drinking. And he had the window, which looked north toward the elm corridor, and beyond it the dark mass of the grounds of Fenwick Hall. The light in the east wing was on, which meant Mrs. Thurston was awake and almost certainly not reading whatever book she had taken to bed with her. He began, as he always did, not with what he knew but with what he had been told. They were different categories, and the difference mattered considerably. Geoffrey Vane had told him that he had stayed with the group throughout the evening, that nothing in particular had seemed to concern Reginald, that he had left around 9 with the Horburys and walked as far as the lane. These 3 statements formed a consistent and internally coherent account. They were also, taking them individually, each contradicted by at least one piece of evidence gathered elsewhere. Mrs. Ames had heard footsteps in the corridor twice, between 8:15 and 9. Nora Galloway had confirmed she was in the hall between roughly 20 to 8 and quarter to 8, and Mr. Horbury had been outside briefly for his cigarette, which placed him on the front path rather than in the corridor. Dr. Prentice had remained in the drawing-room throughout, which Nora had confirmed, noting that Prentice had refilled his own drink at the cabinet and returned to his chair without leaving the room. The footsteps in the corridor, then, were not Nora's, and not Prentice's, and not the Horburys. Thurston himself had used the corridor once, going to his study and returning. That accounted for one set of footsteps. The second set, by elimination, belonged to someone whose account of the evening placed them elsewhere. Vane's account placed him in the drawing-room throughout. The corridor placed him in disagreement. The vicar had seen Vane on the lane at approximately 8:45, walking from the direction of Fenwick Hall. The Horburys had left at 9, and Vane had told Campion he had left with them, had specifically described walking out together as far as the lane, which the Horburys could presumably confirm. If Vane was on the lane at 8:45, he had left Fenwick Hall before the Horburys and then returned, or he had left once and was seen at a point in the lane, consistent with having already been away from the house and come back. Either construction required Vane to have been absent from the drawing-room for a period he had not acknowledged. Campion turned this over for some time with the patience of someone who has learned that conclusions reached in haste carry their haste with them into the damage they do. The overcoat, wrongly buttoned. The vicar had mentioned it as a detail, and the vicar was a details man. A man who buttons his coat in the dark of a country lane might do so carelessly, which was perfectly reasonable. A man who buttons his coat hurriedly, having put it on and taken it off in a shorter interval than usual, might also button it carelessly, and for a less comfortable reason. The coat was evidence of nothing in itself. Combined with the walking pace, the failure to stop and chat, the direction of travel, and the timeline that did not quite resolve, it became part of a constellation that was acquiring, Campion thought, a discernible shape. He got up from the desk and went to the window. Lugg was presumably asleep in the adjacent room, from which a low but confident sound of respiration had been audible for the past hour, suggesting Lugg's conscience was conducting itself in its usual robust good health. The botanical specimen, the gap on the shelf between the Datura and the Digitalis grandiflora, the fragment of card-reading dye. The specimen of Digitalis purpurea was missing. It had been there, the gap and the fragment confirmed its recent presence, and it was not there now. Someone had removed it, or someone had removed only part of it, which is to say the dry, mounted leaf material from which a patient person with a modest reference library could extract, by straightforward maceration in alcohol, a solution of glycoside sufficient to deliver, to a man with a compromised and medication-sensitized heart, a cardiac event that a doctor examining the body the following morning would find entirely consistent with the recorded medical history. This required knowledge. Not expert knowledge, the kind of knowledge available in any decent botanical text, the kind Thurston's own library almost certainly contained. It required access to the specimen, access to the drawing room, access to the brandy glass during an interval when Thurston was absent, and time, not much time, perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 3, in which the room contained one person rather than several. He thought about the papers from the study. Thurston had gone to retrieve them, had been gone 5 minutes by Mrs. Eames' estimate, and had returned to show them to Vane, after which Vane had laughed too emphatically at Mrs. Horbury's story. The papers were almost certainly the accounts. The land venture accounts, in which, according to the farmers at the Crown, the reported returns had been significantly less than the actual returns, the difference presumably finding its way into Geoffrey Vane's pocket over a period of 3 years, producing eventually a car of considerable distinction. Thurston had found the discrepancy, had done the precise, lawyerly thing of pulling the relevant documents and presenting them without accusation, letting the figures speak for themselves, which is the method of a man who has been a solicitor for 30 years and understands that confronting a man with evidence is more effective than confronting him with conclusions. He had shown Vane what he knew. Vane, receiving this information at 20 to 8 in the drawing room, had understood immediately and completely what it meant. Not merely the end of the partnership, not merely the return of defrauded money, but criminal proceedings, a solicitor who would be thorough and methodical and who would not, as the vicar's wife had suggested, be easily shifted from a position once formed. A man of settled habits and particular temperament, a man who did not revisit decisions. Campion returned to the desk and sat for a long time without moving, which was when the thing he had been approaching from several directions simultaneously finally resolved itself into a single point of clarity. He had been treating the specimen removal and the corridor footsteps as separate elements to be connected. They were not separate, they were sequential. Vane had understood his situation at 20 to 8. He had then had, in the drawing room, access to the botanical shelf, which was against the north wall and partially screened from the sofa by the angle of the open door. The group was occupied. Mrs. Horbury's kitchen renovation story was, by all accounts, not brief. He had taken the specimen from the shelf and placed it in his pocket. He had then, sometime after 8:15 when Mrs. Eames made her last visit, used the corridor, let himself briefly out, returned the coat going on, then off, accounting for the wrong buttoning later, and in the interval, alone in the drawing room for 2 minutes at most, had used the preparation he had made outside to compromise the contents of Thurston's brandy glass, which was already poured, already standing in its habitual position beside the pottery jar, exactly where it always stood. He had then rejoined the group, waited, laughed at Mrs. Horbury with the vigor of a man burning off an excess of something, and departed with the Horburys at 9 o'clock, had walked to the lane, had been seen by the vicar at 8:45 already on the lane, which was the one element that did not fit unless Vane had left once before 9, briefly and quietly, for the purpose of preparing what he intended to use, and had returned. 2 absences from the drawing room then, not 1. The first, brief and unnoticed, to step outside and prepare the solution from the specimen already in his pocket, using the hip flask he almost certainly carried as a matter of habit. Campion had seen the slight rectangular shape of it under Vane's jacket at the Crown. The second, equally brief, to return to the drawing room while Thurston was still in his study and introduce the preparation into the glass. The charts had been disturbed during one of these visits, moved, and incorrectly replaced in the haste of a man working quickly in a room that might at any moment receive its other occupants. Campion picked up his pen. He wrote 3 lines on the notepad, considered them, crossed out the second, and rewrote it more precisely. Then he put the pen down and looked at what he had written with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he would very much have preferred not to reach, not because it surprised him, it did not, particularly, but because the arriving at it made necessary a sequence of actions that would cause a considerable quantity of pain to people who had already been caused a considerable quantity of pain and who were managing it with a dignity that deserved better than what was coming. He folded the notepad page and put it in his breast pocket. Then he went to knock on Lug's door, which produced first an interruption of the respiratory sound, then a prolonged silence, then a voice of considerable umbrage, asking what time it was. "Late," said Campion through the door. "I need you to do something for me in the morning." "You need me to do something for you every morning," said Lug. "That's what I'm here for, apparently." "In the morning," said Campion, "I need you to go to the Crown and find out whether either of those tenant farmers has a written record of the quarterly returns from the Vane Thurston land venture, rental agreements, receipts, anything of that kind. Tell them it's for the estate and that it will benefit Mrs. Thurston directly, which is true." A pause. "And if they want to know who I am, tell them you're a friend of the family," said Campion. "It's becoming something of a house style." He heard Lug's conclusive grunt of acceptance, followed by the resumption of the respiratory sound, which was apparently capable of being switched back on with considerable efficiency. Campion went back to his desk and sat in the window light until past midnight, watching the east wing of Fenwick Hall across the darkened village, where the light remained on for a very long time before it finally, quietly, went out. Lug returned from the Crown at 10:30 the following morning, with muddy boots, a folded piece of paper, and the satisfied expression of a man who has accomplished something by the simple method of being large and amiable in a room until people found it easier to help him than not to. He handed the paper to Campion without ceremony and went to find Mrs. Eames, with whom he had established, over the preceding 2 days, the kind of practical alliance that forms naturally between two people who share a professional commitment to the useful over the decorative. The paper contained a handwritten record, prepared that morning by one of the tenant farmers, a man named Aldous Peake, who had, it emerged, kept meticulous notes of every payment made to the Vane Thurston venture since the partnership's inception, because he was the kind of farmer who wrote everything down and had learned early in life that the written-down version of events has a durability that the verbal version conspicuously lacks. The figures ran across 3 years in 4 columns: date, amount paid, to whom paid, and receipt reference. The amounts were consistent and clearly recorded, and they were, as the farmers at the Crown had suggested, considerably in excess of what Vane had been reporting to the partnership accounts. Campion read the figures twice and folded the paper into his breast pocket alongside the notepad page from the previous night. The two documents together constituted not a legal case that was for others, and the others would need to be informed in due course, but they constituted something more immediately useful, which was a fulcrum. In Campion's experience, the most effective final conversations were not those in which the investigator possessed absolute proof, but those in which the investigator possessed just enough of it that the subject understood, without being told explicitly, that the absolute proof was a matter of time and procedure rather than principle. He telephoned Mrs. Thurston from the inn and asked if she would host a small tea that afternoon at Fenwick Hall. She asked who would be invited. He said Geoffrey Vane, if she could arrange it naturally perhaps on the pretext of discussing the ongoing land venture, which Vane himself had mentioned was in need of resolution now that the partnership had lost one of its members. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of the quiet he could hear her understanding something and deciding how to carry it. "Yes," she said. "I can arrange it." "Invite him for 3 o'clock, said Campion. "If you could also ask Mrs. Eames to be available in the kitchen, I'd be grateful. I may want a word with her briefly beforehand." The afternoon was clear and cold, the sky a pale washed blue that gave the village the sharp-edged quality of a photograph developed in good light. Campion walked to Fenwick Hall at 2:15 and spent 20 minutes with Mrs. Eames in the kitchen, not asking questions but reviewing the sequence of the evening one final time. going through it from the beginning in a way that allowed certain details to land in their correct positions now that the surrounding structure was in place. Mrs. Eames listened and confirmed, and occasionally added a small precision, the exact words Vane had used when Thurston had gone to his study. The particular way Vane had been standing when Thurston returned, with the papers and each of these small precisions fitted without forcing into the account, Campion had assembled the previous night. At 3:05 he positioned himself in the sitting room with a cup of tea he intended to drink this time, and at 3 o'clock precisely Geoffrey Vane arrived. He came in looking entirely himself, the broad, well-arranged ease of a man attending a routine social engagement, the good coat correctly buttoned, the handshake for Mrs. Thurston warm and held a moment with the sympathetic pressure of a friend supporting a widow. He saw Campion, and the smile, adjusted by approximately 10%, widening fractionally in the way of smiles that are managing rather than expressing, and he said, with complete smoothness, "Campion, still in the village." "Another day or two," said Campion pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind my being here. Dorothea asked if I'd sit in, since the land venture involves matters I know something about." This was not true, but it was not checkable in the next 30 seconds, and 30 seconds was all he needed for Vane to decide that objecting to Campion's presence was a more conspicuous choice than accepting it. Vane accepted it, with the good grace of a man who has no alternative and knows it. They sat down, all three of them, in the arrangement that rooms dictate Mrs. Thurston in the armchair nearest the window, Vane on the sofa, Campion in the chair that placed him at an angle to both. Mrs. Thurston opened the matter of the land venture, practically and without evident strain. She had been thinking, she said, about the quarterly returns and what they implied for her current financial position. She had some figures that her solicitor had asked her to review. She produced a sheet of paper, Aldous Peake's record, which Campion had given her that morning with the suggestion that she place it on the table without comment if and when the opportunity presented itself. She placed it on the table. Vane looked at it. The looking lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and then he looked up and said, "Where did this come from?" "The tenant," said Mrs. Thurston. "Mr. Peake. He keeps very thorough records." "He does," said Vane. The geniality was intact, but it was working considerably harder than usual, the way a structure works hard when the load on it has been increased without prior notice. "These are his internal records, of course. They don't necessarily correspond to the net figures after costs, which is the relevant measure for the partnership accounts. There are operational expenses, maintenance, drainage work on the east parcel that Peake wouldn't have been tracking." "Of course," said Campion. "What would those costs amount to, roughly, over the 3-year period?" "I'd need to check the full accounts," said Vane. "Off the top of my head, a figure in that range would be accounted for, the range being approximately £12,000 across 3 years, said Campion, in the tone of a man confirming a shared understanding, between what Peake paid in and what the partnership accounts show as received. The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. Campion had counted silences long enough to have developed an instinct for their quality, and this one had the specific quality of a man performing rapid internal calculations and finding that each calculation produces the same unwelcome result. "That's a rough figure," said Vane. "It is," agreed Campion, "though I imagine Reginald's figure was rather more precise. He was a precise man, as we've both noted. He'd have gone through the accounts with the thoroughness of a 30-year solicitor, and he'd have arrived at a number he was confident in before he showed you the papers." He paused. The papers he retrieved from his study on the evening of the 14th. The room had acquired the particular stillness that rooms acquire when the conversation in them has moved into territory from which there is no comfortable retreat. Mrs. Thurston was looking at the window with the composed attention of a woman who has prepared herself for this and is holding the preparation firmly. Vane was looking at Campion with an expression that had given up the effort of geniality without yet settled on what to replace it with. "You're suggesting something," said Vane. His voice had changed in register. Not much, but detectably the easy warmth replaced by something flatter and more watchful. "I'm not suggesting anything," said Campion. "I'm describing what I understand to have happened on the evening of the 14th, and I'd like you to tell me if my description is inaccurate." He leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who has no urgency about any of this. "Reginald showed you the accounts. You understood what they meant. You were aware that Reginald was the kind of man who, having formed a view, would pursue it to its conclusion without deviation, and that his conclusion in this case would involve the return of the money, a dissolution of the partnership, and almost certainly a referral to the appropriate authorities." Vane said nothing. "You had, in that drawing room, access to something that offered you an alternative," Campion continued. "Reginald's specimen collection, which included a preparation of digitalis purpurea, and Reginald's brandy glass, which was poured and standing unattended for approximately 5 minutes, while Reginald was in his study." He said this without raising his voice or altering his pace, as though describing a sequence of events as straightforward as a train timetable. "You left the house once, briefly, to prepare the solution, and you returned. The vicar saw you on the lane at 8:45, which is before the Horburys left, and before you told me you departed." Vane put down his cup. He did it very carefully, with the deliberate control of a man who is aware that his hands are being observed and is determined they will reveal nothing. They revealed the determination, which was its own kind of revelation. "You have no proof of any of this," he said. "I have a tenant's payment records that place the fraud beyond reasonable question," said Campion equably. "I have a witness who saw you on the lane at a time inconsistent with your account. I have a gap on a botanical shelf, a misplaced chart, and a pattern of movement through this house on the evening of the 14th that only resolves correctly if you were in the drawing room, alone between 8:15 and 9. He tilted his head, with the mild curiosity of a man examining an interesting object. "I don't have the glass, because it was washed, but the glass is one component, and components have a way of accumulating once the accumulation begins." The fire in the grate had burned down to a low, steady heat that gave the room a warmth disproportionate to its visible source. Outside, the garden was still in the cold afternoon light, and the elms at the boundary stood in their patient, impartial row. Vane sat for a long time without speaking. When he finally did speak, his voice was quiet and entirely without the social performance that had characterized every previous sentence he had produced in Campion's presence. What remained when the performance was removed was something diminished and precise. The voice of a man who has decided that the arithmetic no longer supports the position and is adjusting accordingly. "Reginald was going to ruin me," he said. "Yes," said Campion, "I expect he was. 3 years of work. The land, the management, the tenant relationships. I built all of that." "With his capital," said Campion, not unkindly, but without ambiguity. Vane looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long time, and then he looked at Mrs. Thurston, who was still looking at the window, and who did not turn when his gaze found her, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing that happened in that room all afternoon. "What happens now?" said Vane. "Now," said Campion, "I make a telephone call to a colleague at the county constabulary who is a reasonable and methodical man, and I explain to him what I've explained to you, rather more fully and with the relevant documents. What happens after that is not my department." He stood up. "I'd suggest you remain in the village for the time being, Mr. Vane. Leaving abruptly would be an unhelpful choice." Vane did not stand. He remained on the sofa with the stillness of a man from whom something very large has departed, leaving behind it a space that hasn't yet decided what it is. He looked, Campion thought, precisely like a man who has spent 3 years building something carefully in the wrong direction, and has only now fully apprehended the distance he is from where he intended to be. Campion set down his cup, which he had finished, and nodded to Mrs. Thurston, who turned from the window at last with the contained, complicated expression of a woman who has been right about something and finds the being right considerably less satisfying than she had anticipated. He left them in the room together, which was the only mercy currently available, and went to find the telephone in the hall, where the afternoon light lay in long, pale rectangles across the floor, and the silver salver on the side table held its small stack of condolence cards, each one representing a version of events that was about to be substantially revised. The telephone call took 11 minutes. Campion's colleague at the county constabulary, a Detective Inspector Reeve, whom he had known for 15 years and who had the measured, unhurried quality of a man who processes information the way good bread is made, without rushing and with appropriate intervals for things to settle, listened without interruption through the first 7 minutes, asked 4 precise questions during the next 3, and in the final minute confirmed that he would drive to Morcott Pellow the following morning with a colleague and would be grateful if Campion could ensure that the relevant documents and the relevant witnesses were available. He said this in the tone of a man who has received unusual information before and has learned that the most productive response is immediate practicality rather than extended comment. Campion replaced the receiver and stood in the hall for a moment, in the quiet that follows a significant telephone call, the particular quiet of a thing set in motion that will now proceed under its own momentum, regardless of anyone's further preferences in the matter. The condolence cards on the silver salver seemed, in this light, to belong to a chapter that was closing. He straightened one that had slipped sideways and went to tell Mrs. Thurston what had been arranged. She was alone in the sitting room. Vane had gone, she said. He had left 10 minutes after Campion, without speaking, having sat for those 10 minutes with the unmoving quality of a man conducting an internal reckoning of some depth and complexity. She had not tried to speak to him, and he had not tried to speak to her. He had stood, buttoned his coat correctly this time. Campion noted she mentioned, with a dry precision she had apparently not intended, and then decided not to retract and walked out of Fenwick Hall without looking back. Campion told her about Reeve and the morning visit. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the fire, which had been rebuilt since the afternoon and was burning with the steady, uncomplicated warmth of a fire that has been properly laid. When he finished, she was quiet for a time. That was not uncomfortable. "The Digitalis," she said at last, "from Reginald's own collection." Yes, she absorbed this. He would have found that particularly. She stopped and began again. Reginald had a strong sense of the appropriate. He would have found that a very specific kind of insult. "I think he would," said Campion. There was nothing useful to add to that, and he did not attempt to add it. She looked up from the fire. "Nora," she said, "the snuff box." "Nora took nothing," said Campion. "She went to look at it. That's all it was." He considered how much to give her, and gave her the whole of it, because she had earned the whole of it by being right when everyone else had told her she was wrong. Nora's behavior that evening was driven entirely by her own guilt about the chair and her anticipation of being excluded from everything she associated with this house. What she did was foolish, and she knows it was foolish, but it had nothing to do with Reginald's death beyond providing, coincidentally, a misleading point of focus. Mrs. Thurston was quiet again. Then, "And Dr. Prentice." "Prentice made an honest mistake," said Campion. "He had every clinical reason to certify the death as he did. A man with a documented cardiac condition on medication that interacts with precisely the compound that was used dying in circumstances entirely consistent with his medical history. Prentice had no cause to look further. He didn't look further because there was no visible reason to look further. A pause. He also, I think, had a personal reason for not looking too closely at anything connected with Nora Galloway, which made him somewhat less thorough than he might otherwise have been. But his error was one of incomplete information rather than intention. "He and Nora," said Mrs. Thurston. It was not a question. She said it with the tone of someone confirming something they had noticed without having been certain they were permitted to notice it. "That's their business," said Campion, "and I'd suggest it remains so." She nodded once, in the manner of someone filing something correctly. The fire shifted and settled with the small, private sound of burning wood, finding a new arrangement. Outside, the garden had passed into full dark, and the elms were invisible except as a slightly denser darkness at the boundary of what the window could show. "Lug has found your car," said Mrs. Eames from the doorway, addressing Campion with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who considers domestic logistics continuous with all other events. "He says he's checked it over and it's ready for the morning. He also says to tell you he's had his supper at the Crown and won't be wanting anything later, which he asked me to mention because he said you'd worry otherwise." "I wouldn't worry," said Campion. "No," agreed Mrs. Ames, with the precision of someone who is aware that this is the correct answer and not necessarily the true one. She withdrew. Mrs. Thurston almost smiled. It was the first time since Campion had arrived in Morcott Pellow that her face had produced anything approaching that expression, and it arrived with the careful hesitancy of something that has been absent long enough to be uncertain of its welcome. "He's been very kind, your Lug," she said, "to Mrs. Eames particularly. She's found the last fortnight very hard. She was fond of Reginald in the way that people who work closely with very organized men become fond of them. The organization provides a kind of security that goes beyond the merely professional. He was a man whose systems people relied on," said Campion. "Yes." She looked at the fire. "And now someone will have to build new ones." He left her with that task ahead of her and the fire at its steadiest, and walked back to the inn in the dark along the lane beneath the elms, which were conducting their usual dignified commentary in a wind that had picked up since nightfall. He thought, as he walked, about the village behind him, the particular quality of a place that has sustained a secret and is about to be relieved of it, the way bodies are relieved of infections, which is to say not painlessly and not without residue, but ultimately, despite the process, with improved prospects for what comes after. Detective Inspector Reeve arrived at 9:15 the following morning, accompanied by a younger colleague whose name was Sergeant Fowler and whose primary quality, as far as Campion could determine, was a notebook held at a permanent angle of professional readiness. They sat in the sitting room at Fenwick Hall, the same room in which Campion had first heard about the botanical chart, and the grey-green eyes had told him something was wrong, and Campion presented the account with the same economy he had presented it to Vane, minus the pauses for social effect and plus the documentation, which Reeve handled with the appreciation of a man who has spent a career being given verbal accounts and receiving physical evidence as a comparative rarity. Aldous Peake's records went into Fowler's evidence folder with the satisfied click of a document finding its purpose. The notepad page went in after it. Campion described the botanical shelf, the missing specimen, the card fragment, the displaced charts, and their incorrect replacement. He described the corridor and its hinge and the two sets of footsteps and their process of elimination. He described the vicar's sighting of Vane on the lane at 8:45 and the wrongly buttoned coat and the quality of the walking. He described the 1-second pause before Vane's denial of returning to the drawing room and gave Reeve his assessment of its significance, being careful to label it as assessment rather than evidence, which Reeve appreciated, and Fowler noted with the diligence of a young man for whom the distinction between inference and fact is still a relatively new and interesting frontier. Reeve listened to all of it with the complete attention of a man who is constructing as he listens rather than waiting to respond. When Campion finished, Reeve sat for a moment with his hands flat on his knees and said, "The glass." "Washed," said Campion. "The following morning, Mrs. Eames, no knowledge of its significance." Reeve nodded once, accepting this as an investigative fact of life rather than a catastrophe. The specimen gone. Vane would have disposed of it outside the house on the evening itself. The hip flask, presumably also. Body's been buried 4 days after the death, but the family plot in the churchyard. Campion paused. An exhumation order, the body in relatively good condition given the time elapsed, and a laboratory looking specifically for glycoside compounds in a man who was not, at the time of his death, prescribed any preparation containing them that would constitute considerably more than the circumstantial picture currently available. Reeve was quiet for a moment. "You're confident," he said. "I'm confident that what I've described happened," said Campion. "I'm appropriately cautious about what a court will make of the components individually. But Peake's records establish the fraud conclusively, which establishes the motive with the same conclusiveness and motive of that clarity attached to a timeline that doesn't resolve in the way the subject claims it resolves. That's a foundation." He looked at Reeve with the mild steadiness of a man who has been doing this long enough to know where his competence ends and other people's begins. "The rest is your department." Reeve permitted himself a brief expression of satisfaction, the kind that doesn't reach the full face but moves the corners of it slightly in the direction of approval. "Geoffrey Vane," he said. "He's in the village," said Campion. "I suggested he remain there. Whether he took the suggestion is a question of character, but my reading of him is that he's a man who calculates probabilities, and he'll have calculated that leaving would accelerate rather than prevent the current proceedings." He was correct in this assessment. Vane was at his home on the south side of the village when Reeve and Fowler called at 11 o'clock, and he came to the door in the manner of a man who has spent the night deciding what posture to adopt and has settled, with the practical intelligence that had served him effectively in business, if not in ethics, on a cooperative one. This Campion learned afterward from Reeve, who telephoned the inn at 12:30 to confirm the arrest and to express, in the economical language of professional courtesy, that the morning had been productive. Campion ate lunch at the inn, a decent lamb chop that deserved more attention than he gave it, and then went to Fenwick Hall for the last time to say goodbye to Mrs. Thurston. She was in the garden, doing something purposeful to a rose bed with a pair of secateurs, and the focused application of a woman who has discovered that physical tasks of moderate complexity are an effective companion to large and unresolved feelings. She looked up when he came through the gate. The morning had brought colour to her face, the cold, and the business of being outside, and perhaps the particular quality of a morning on which something long unresolved has moved at last toward resolution. "Reeve telephoned me as well," she said, "before you ask." "Good," said Campion. He was very direct. I appreciated that. She turned back to the rose and made 2 precise cuts. "I keep thinking about the chart, the green one at the back." She shook her head slightly. Reginald would have noticed that himself within the day. "He went to those charts almost every morning." "He would have noticed," said Campion, "and he would have known what it meant." She considered this. "Small mercies," she said, with a quietness that contained both grief and something that was not quite its opposite, but was at least distinguishable from it. He took his leave of her in the garden, and of Mrs. Eames at the back door, who handed him a paper bag containing 2 portions of the pastry she had been making when he first sat at her kitchen table, and said that it was Bramley apple and that it travelled well, which was the most sustained compliment she was apparently prepared to offer. He accepted it with the genuine gratitude it deserved. Lug had the car running at the gate with the efficient preparation of a man who has been ready to leave since Tuesday and considers Friday morning a satisfactory if slightly delayed departure. The village was going about its midday business with the unhurried regularity that villages maintain through all weathers of event, the post office conducting its affairs, the church standing in its customary posture of patient availability, the crown preparing for its lunchtime wave, the elm corridor waiting at the north end of the lane to receive them back into its tunnel of branches and release them on the other side into a Suffolk that knew nothing of Morcott Pellow and would continue not knowing with perfect equanimity. "Well?" said Lug, as the elms closed over them. "Well?" said Campion. "Sorted, is it?" "It's sorted," said Campion. He settled back in his seat and looked at the road ahead, which was straight and pale and entirely without incident for as far as he could see. "Reeve will take it from here. He's thorough." "What about the niece?" said Lug. "The niece will have a difficult few months, and then a somewhat better year," said Campion. "She's sensible enough, underneath the restlessness. She made one bad decision and has spent 8 months already paying for it. I suspect she'll make fewer bad decisions going forward, which is about as much as any of us can honestly promise." "And the doctor?" Campion considered this. "The doctor will continue to be a good doctor in a village that needs one," he said. "He'll be more thorough in future, I expect. Thorough in the way of a man who has learned that comfortable conclusions require the same rigor as uncomfortable ones." A pause. "The other matter is his own affair." Lug produced his conclusive grunt of acceptance, which served as his standard response to matters that didn't require further comment, and several that did. The road ran on between autumn fields that were managing the decline of the season with the stoic grace of things that know perfectly well what comes next and have decided to go through it with dignity. A church tower appeared briefly above a tree line to the east and disappeared again. A tractor moved along a distant field boundary with the slow, deliberate patience of agricultural machinery that has all day and is using it. Campion ate one of Mrs. Eames' pastry portions somewhere east of Stowmarket and found it excellent, the pastry short and correctly seasoned, the apple retaining enough resistance to justify the effort of the fork he had to improvise from the glove compartment, which contained a plastic implement of uncertain provenance that Lug claimed to know nothing about and which served the purpose adequately if not elegantly. He thought, for a moment, about Reginald Thurston, the precise man with his ordered charts and his particular glass and his 30 years of legal training that had led him, in the end, to do the correct and methodical thing in the face of a betrayal, which was to produce the evidence quietly and place it on the table and let it speak for itself. It was the right instinct, and it had cost him everything, which was the kind of fact that doesn't resolve into any comfortable shape, no matter how long you turn it. Some facts are like that. You learn, after a time, to carry them without expecting them to lighten. The road into London began to assert itself through the accumulating evidence of increased traffic, reduced hedgerows, and the progressive replacement of open sky with the particular overhead texture of a city that has been spreading outward since the Romans and shows no sign of having found its preferred dimensions. Lug navigated this transition with his customary grim competence, and Campion finished the second pastry portion and put the paper bag tidily in the door pocket and watched the city arrive around them with the mild, unsentimental interest of a man returning from somewhere specific to somewhere general, which is a journey that always feels slightly shorter than it ought to, because the specific has a weight that the general, for all its size, tends to lack. They reached Piccadilly at 4:30. Lug stopped the car with his usual precise economy of movement and sat for a moment before getting out, which was unusual enough to be notable. "That woman," he said. "Mrs. Thurston." "Yes," said Campion. "She'll be all right," said Lug. It was neither a question nor a comfort exactly. It was the considered judgment of a man who has spent a career observing people under pressure, and has developed, through this observation, a reliable, if unscientific sense of which ones will find their feet. He said it with the flat certainty of a verdict. Campion looked at the familiar street, the evening beginning to come in, at the edges of the October sky, the lights of the shops, the particular quality of London going about its business at the end of an ordinary day that was not ordinary in any way that the city would ever know about. "Yes," he said, "she will." He got out of the car, took the paper bag from the door pocket out of habit, found it empty, and placed it in the nearest bin with the satisfaction of a man completing a small, final, entirely manageable task. Then he went upstairs to his flat, where the previous week's post was still on the table, the Inland Revenue letter still unopened, and the pigeon on the opposite roof was conducting its affairs with the magnificent indifference of a creature that has no opinion whatsoever about what has just been resolved in a Suffolk village and requires none. It was, all things considered, a perfectly adequate Thursday.